Hello and welcome to another anatomy video brought to you by the pair of floating hands. Now, today we're going to discuss the pterygopalatine ganglion, a parasympathetic ganglion located in a small crevice at the base of the skull called the pterygopalatine fossa. Now, this is one video which is part of our series on the autonomous nervous system. So, if you want to watch something more, you can see the playlist down below. Okay, so let's kick off this video by discussing the location of this guy. First of all, the pterygopalatine fossa, this is a small crevice located in between the pterygoid process, the maxilla, the sphenoid bone, and the palatine bone on the medial wall. That's located at the base of the skull. Now, I know it's very big here, you can see almost as my hand, but I've drawn this just for representation purposes. Technically speaking, this pterygopalatine fossa is probably smaller than half of my distal phalanx of the pinky, right? So it's a very, very tight space and quite hard to dissect and quite hard to visualize. But if you want to think about it in more simpler terms, you can think about this pterygopalatine fossa as a small pyramid which has its top towards the bottom side here. So you have the anterior wall of the pyramid made by the maxilla, the posterior wall of the pyramid by the pterygoid process, the superior by the sphenoid bone, the medial wall here is the palatine bone, and the back wall, actually you don't have a wall there. This is the lateral wall, is just a large opening that links the pterygopalatine fossa to the infratemporal fossa. And this small crevice, you have the pterygopalatine ganglion here, as we discussed. You also have the terminal portion of the maxillary artery there, called the pterygopalatine portion of the maxillary artery. And these guys go all the way around the entire head and all the cavities, like the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, they go in the orbit, so they get some nerves from the skull, etc., from the skull cavity, from the base of the skull. So you have all of these things going in and out of this fossa, and they go out through different openings of this pterygopalatine fossa that allows for the passage, right? And these openings are the infraorbital foramen, which is on the anterior wall, on the maxilla basically. On the back wall you have, which connects to the orbit, of course. On the medial wall you have the sphenopalatine foramen going to the nose. At the tip here you have the major and minor palatine foramens, which go, of course, to the oral cavity, to the roof of the oral cavity, soft and hard palate. On the posterior wall, around here, the pterygoid process, around the pterygoid process you have foramen rotundum, which goes to the skull. You have the foramen of the pterygoid canal, you have the palatovaginal canal, the second one goes to the pharynx, and this one goes to the skull, and therefore different nerves there. And of course the pterygomaxillary fissure, which is basically not a wall, it's just a big gaping hole, as you can see here, right? This entire space here is called the pterygomaxillary fissure. And this fissure is, in short, the way the pterygoid artery, the maxillary artery would go in the pterygopalatine fossa. So this is a very nice summary of this space and all of the holes and openings that allow for the passage of nerve and arteries. Now, before we discuss the anatomy of the pterygopalatine ganglion, I mean the macroscopic anatomy, I would like for us to go over the neuroanatomy of this region, because that would help quite a bit with explaining everything else. So, first of all, we said that this is a parasympathetic ganglion in the beginning. Interestingly, though, apart from parasympathetic fibers, you do get some sympathetic fibers, and you also get sensory fibers. And the end nerve, the nerve originating from this ganglion, all of them have these three sensory modalities, or motor modalities, right? Depending on how you look at it. But they do have these three types of fibers. So why call it a parasympathetic ganglion? Because only the bodies of the parasympathetic system are located here, right? These are the only neuronal bodies. The other two fibers are just passing through the ganglion without actually making any connections inside of it. And this is how usually ganglia are named. Okay, so let's go over all of the three parts of this ganglion. You have a sympathetic, a parasympathetic, and a sensory route. The sensory route is the easiest to explain. You have the maxillary nerve, which goes adjacent to the ganglion inside of the pterygopalatine fossa, and they just exchange some fibers. The maxillary nerve gives sensory fibers to the ganglion, and the ganglion gives parasympathetic fibers to the nerve. Now, these parasympathetic fibers would go along the zygomaticotemporal zygomaticofacial nerves, branch out of them, and go in the orbital fossa, the orbit, connect to the lacrimal nerve, and innervate the lacrimal gland. This is how the lacrimal gland gets innervation. Now, there is some debate about if this happens exactly like that we're going to see when we go over our gross anatomy section. But this is the general way most people describe it. Regardless of which camp you like, the lacrimal gland will take its parasympathetic fibers from the pterygopalatine ganglion, just there are different suggestions for the way that happens. Okay, and speaking of the parasympathetic fibers, where are these guys coming from? If you trace them back, you would see that they come from the superior salivary nucleus of the facial nerve. So these fibers, part of these fibers from this superior salivatory nucleus would branch off as the major petrosal nerve. Now you do see that this major petrosal nerve actually connects with another nerve, which is called the deep petrosal nerve, and those two guys together are called the nerve of the pterygoid canal. Now, where is this guy coming from? Going again with the same question. If you trace it back, you would see it comes from the spinal cord, and this is the lateral horn of the spinal cord. If you do remember, or if you don't, you can refer to our other videos on the autonomous nervous system. But sympathetic nervous system comes from the spinal cord, and at these levels, T1, T12, from a structure called the lateral horn that's present only around this area, for the most part. And these cells here, these first order sympathetic neurons, give off a branch which goes and make a connection with the second order sympathetic neuron, which is found in the ganglia of the so-called sympathetic trunk. The second order neuron would make a nerve plexus around the arteries, in this case the internal carotid artery, so it would wrap around the artery like a net and go along with the artery, hence reaching its targets thanks to the artery, right? It hitchhikes the artery. The plexus is called the internal carotid plexus, and when the internal carotid artery reaches the base of the skull, it would give off a branch, and that branch would be named the deep petrosal nerve. And again, the union of the deep petrosal and the major petrosal would be called the pterygoid nerve, or the nerve of the pterygoid canal. The parasympathetic fibers would connect to the second order neuron parasympathetic, while the sympathetic are already second order, so they would just go along and cross. And this is how this ganglion would get these three innervation types, and in short, it would go to the nasal mucosa, to the palatine mucosa, and to the pharyngeal mucosa, along with the lacrimal gland, of course. And it would give sympathetic, parasympathetic, and vascular innervation for all of these areas, meaning for the glands, for the blood vessels, for the sensation of the mucosas, right? When you scratch your nose, you know that you're scratching it. Actually, not exactly like that, but let's put it like that. When you touch your palate with your tongue, you know that you're touching it, right? So this is the maxillary nerve. Extra. Okay, so the gross anatomy of the region. What are the main branches? What are their names, right? if we learn anatomy, we usually we don't like to, because it's hard, but we have to kind of know the anatomy quite precisely. Now, to be honest, if you're not some very niche neurosurgeon or neurologist, you probably won't need that in your daily day-to-day practice, but still. Again, you have your pterygopalatine fossa, you have your pterygopalatine ganglion. And you have the major petrosal nerve coming from the facial nerve, and you have the deep petrosal nerve coming from the internal carotid plexus. These guys together form the nerve of the pterygoid canal, which goes through the pterygoid canal and gives you the sympathetic and parasympathetic sympathetic fibers for the ganglion. Again, you have adjacent to the ganglion, you have the maxillary nerve, which sends communicating branches to the ganglion, exchanging fibers. We already discussed how. And if we start naming all of these nerves originating from the ganglion, first of all, you would get the pharyngeal nerve, which goes through the palatovaginal foramen in order to innervate the mucosa of the nasopharynx. The several branches would go into the sphenopalatine foramen, and these branches are the nasal branches. More precisely, they are called the posterior superior branches, which innervate the lateral part, and the biggest one of those branches is called the nasopalatine nerve, which innervates the medial part, the posterior medial part of the nose. So the nasal cavity is mostly innervated by the pterygopalatine ganglion, by these posterior and medial and lateral branches. Again, the medial is called the nasopalatine nerve. Next, you get the orbital branches, which go through the orbit and reach the ethmoidal sinuses. And now here comes the difference in the different views. Some guys say that these orbital branches give direct or innervation to the lacrimal gland or through the lacrimal nerve. And the other, more common understanding is that the pterygopalatine ganglion gives the maxillary nerve some parasympathetic fibers, which go to the zygomaticotemporal branch, and then again they reach the lacrimal nerve and go to the lacrimal gland. This one, the second one, is the more commonly accepted version. Now, we did say that it also innervates the oral cavity, and that would happen through the major and minor palatine nerves. The major would innervate the hard palate, while the minor would innervate the soft palate, along with the tonsils, not a little bit, but the tonsils in general. Now, what's the deal with this small space here? Is it important clinically speaking? Well, yes, and there is a very niche way you can speak about it. There is something that's, you know, that there are different types of headaches. In general, when you have pain in the head, it's not just one thing. You might have very different ways that the headaches would be localized, very different location of the headaches, and very different various pathophysiology behind the headaches. One of these type of headaches are could be due, which are called, by the way, called cluster headaches, could be due to irritation of the pterygopalatine ganglion. Now, since you have sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers coming from different ways to the ganglion, if due to some inflammation or irritation of the region, very often irritation of this parasympathetic ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion, can lead to vasomotor effects like dilation of the blood vessels, which usually can lead to migraines, as well as vasoconstriction as well, right? But these headaches could be accompanied with something else. You could get a headache with a stuffed nose, a headache with hyperactive lacrimal gland, a headache with some throat stuff again, feeling like a little bit of coarse throat, right? Why? Because this one innervates the nose, it innervates the palate, right? It innervates the lacrimal gland. So if it's irritated, apart from giving you the headaches, they could be accompanied by symptoms from its other innervation areas, which are tearing, stuffed nose, and a little bit of probably coarse throat. And that's pretty much it as far as the clinical part goes. What I've heard, what I've seen so far, I will put it down below in the link. We did not discuss the other contents of the fossa because it's not the point of this video. But in the pterygopalatine fossa, you have the pterygopalatine part sorry, of the maxillary artery. And the maxillary artery is very twisty and bendy, it's very tortuous. So if you have the ganglion, the artery can go like behind the ganglion, loop around it, go around it, etc. So it could compress it. And this irritation of the ganglion may not be due to trauma or to inflammation. It might be due to vascular compression, as for example the trigeminal neuralgia, right? You do know that sometimes if you have the trigeminal ganglion and you have the internal carotid artery just next to it, if it has an aneurysm or is just very close, it could press on the trigeminal ganglion and induce again trigeminal neuralgia, very, very severe pain around your head and face, right? So this is something similar, but instead the trigeminal ganglion, you have the pterygopalatine ganglion, and instead of the instead of the internal carotid artery, you have the maxillary artery. So it could give you similar pathophysiology to headaches, but with different symptoms, right? Based on the anatomy of the region. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. If you liked it, leave a comment down below. If you disliked it, again, tell me why and leave a comment down below. If you are interested in a specific topic that we don't have a video on yet and you would like to see it, again, write it down so I can make one more. Okay, hope it was useful. Have a nice day. Enjoy the rest of your week. And till next time,